What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to XJW Diaries. My name is Justin. So once again, the Watchtower has found themselves under investigation by yet another country. Those of you who know me, you know that the ARC, the Australian Royal Commission, played a major part in waking me up and causing me to leave the Jehovah's Witnesses. And now, years later, New Zealand has their own Royal Commission who has done their own investigation into the Jehovah's Witnesses. And once again, they have found that the Watchtower's response, the Watchtower's policies, when it comes to the protection of young people and children within their organization is inadequate. And not just inadequate, it puts both children within the organization and children on the outside in danger. Now, one of the biggest reasons that the ARC was the thing that woke me up is because the majority of the things that we talk about on this channel and other channels, it comes down to mental conditioning. It comes down to the Watchtower's manipulation tactics. It comes down to their mistranslations and the ways that they use guilt, fear, and shame to control their members. And while all of that stuff is very negative, while all that stuff creates a very toxic culture, and all of that stuff, especially if you study psychology, it's clearly wrong. The thing is, all of those things, especially when you are trained by the Jehovah's Witnesses, all of those things with enough mental gymnastics, you can begin to justify them and put them in the back of your mind. If it had just been those things, I would still be a Jehovah's Witness today. But when it comes to the issue of child protection, when it comes to this issue of abuse, there is no amount of mental gymnastics that can justify what the Watchtower is doing. This comes down to common sense. What they are doing is clearly wrong. And the longer they go trying to deny it, the longer they go turning a blind eye to this issue, the more damage they are causing, the more lives they are impacting. And so that's why this was a big issue for me. That's why it is such a passionate issue when I talk about it on this channel, because it is just clearly wrong. So let's get into this report from New Zealand and see what they were able to find about how the Watchtower fails at protecting children within their organization. And it's also very important to remember that a lot of these issues go beyond the Watchtower. A lot of these issues are mimicked in other high control religious groups and even non-religious groups. Now, before we get into this investigation and their findings, I think it is important to just acknowledge, even though it is sad to think about, but it's the reality of it. The fact is, we get to talk about this stuff today, just talk about it. But the fact that this investigation happened and the fact that their findings show that the Watchtower is inadequate, what that means is that there are people out there, many people out there, who have lived this. So yeah, we get to talk about it, but somebody out there has had to live this stuff. And who knows how long it takes to be able to recover and heal from this type of damage, if ever. So I think it's really important to keep those people in mind. This is the reason why it's so important to keep spreading this awareness. The more we do this, the higher chance there is that something may happen someday that puts up more barriers so that more children are not put in danger in this way. Now, this New Zealand investigation comes in two parts. The first is the investigation and their findings, and the second part is their suggestions. So first, let's get into their investigation and their findings. And I'll just stick to the main points. And if you want to look into the full report, I would definitely suggest you do it. Again, I got the links down below. So one of the first key points in this investigation is found at point number 4, which says several factors within the faith increased the risk of abuse occurring during the inquiry period, including the status of elders and the power and influence they exercised, particularly over children and young people. The faith had high barriers to the disclosure of abuse, making it more difficult for individuals to disclose any abuse either to others within the faith or to secular authorities. These barriers included the inferior position of women within the faith, rigid disclosure processes, the fear of being shunned, and the relative disconnection from non-Jehovah's Witnesses, all of which likely prevented or delayed victims from disclosing abuse. There was also inadequate vetting of elders and insufficient training in preventing or responding to abuse. So there's already a lot of things going on just in that one point. But I think one of the key things that we got to pay attention to here is that this point demolishes that argument that Jehovah's Witnesses have. If you get a Jehovah's Witness to actually acknowledge that there are abusers within the organization, what they will usually say is something to the effect of, well, it's bad people within the organization, but it's not the organization's fault. And this is an argument that I've heard from several different organizations. They all say something similar to this argument. It's bad people, not a bad organization. But what this point shows from this investigation in New Zealand is that this is on the organization. Their policies and their procedures and the way that they respond to these issues is an organizational problem. And this is a problem that puts more children in danger. One of the things that they mentioned was that the organization has a high barrier to the disclosure of abuse. And of course, as former witnesses, we know that this barrier is put up because the Watchtower cares more about protecting their reputation, protecting the brand, than they do about protecting their members. They mentioned the inferior position of women within the faith. That is another very key point. There are women who have been abused. In fact, I've interviewed several of them. If you watch the documentary, you've seen some of them. They get abused, and it's blamed on them, in particular because of the way that the Watchtower views women. These women are often viewed as some sort of temptress, and the victim gets blamed. Another point they mention is the fear of being shunned. And again, that plays another major role. We saw this in the Australian Royal Commission, actually, where you had people who were abused. They were told not to go to the authorities, or they were told, because there's not two witnesses, there's nothing that can be done. These people then went ahead to the authorities to seek justice, which they rightfully should do, and the Jehovah's Witnesses punished them for seeking that justice. They say that they are bringing reproach on Jehovah's name by going to the authorities. Therefore, they get disfellowshipped, they're shunned for their own abuse. Now, another point that they mention is the inadequate vetting of elders. And this is another very, very important point. The Watchtower has placed these elders as leaders, as pillars of safety, pillars of structure within each congregation. And so they really should be vetting these elders. They really should be ensuring that these elders have the right training and the right knowledge to take care of and keep safe the congregations that they're overseeing. But instead of making sure that these elders have the right training and knowledge, instead of that, 9 times out of 10, what makes a man qualified to be an elder is really just being a yes man. Showing on the outside, who cares about what's on the inside? You're showing what's on the outside, that you are willing and able to do whatever the organization tells you to do. That you are willing and able to sacrifice whenever the organization tells you to sacrifice. And that qualification is not enough to keep the organization safe. So now let's skip down to point number 7 in this investigation. The inquiry concludes that the Jehovah's Witnesses took inadequate steps to prevent and respond to abuse and care during the inquiry period. The policies, rules, and standards relevant to CSA more broadly were primarily based on passages from the Bible and located across many different Jehovah's Witness publications. Processes for handling and responding to disclosure of abuse of any kind were outdated and ineffective, such as the requirement for 2 witnesses to child abuse. There was a lack of reporting to external authorities and inadequate consequences for abusers within the faith. These factors applied equally to abuse and care. So these are all things that us as XJW activists, apostates, have been saying for quite a long time. The Jehovah's Witnesses policies, in particular the 2-witness rule, they are outdated, they make no sense, they put children in danger. Now, the other very important point that they brought up is the inadequate consequences for abusers. This is something you heard me talk about quite a bit, so I don't want to repeat myself too much in this video, but it is worth saying this is a major, major problem. Abusing a child is a crime. It is literally a crime. You are breaking the law, okay? In the real world, when you break the law in that way, you get to go to jail. You get to pay fines. Most importantly, you have to register as a sex offender. When you make that registration, you put up barriers to prevent more children from being harmed. It's very, very, very important. When you commit that same crime in these religions, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, you don't have to go to jail. You get disfellowship. You may get disfellowship, assuming there's enough evidence. In other cases, you get to go scot-free. And they might keep a close eye on you. But that's it. And this is another thing where, again, the Jehovah's Witnesses are not the only religion doing this. There are several of these high control religious groups that have this practice of having known child abusers that they do not report to the police. Therefore, they don't have to register as offenders. Therefore, those of us that are on the outside of these organizations have no idea. Now, you've heard me talk about that issue really since I started this channel. And back then, it was a big deal for me. But imagine how much more of a big deal it is for me today, now that I am the father of my own child. That is terrifying, that I have this knowledge that there are several religious organizations out there. All of these religions will assure you that they are great people, that they have moral standards that are above the rest of the world. And yet all of these religious organizations have this issue where they do not protect their members. They do not protect people on the outside. These religions honestly believe that they can pray over the abuser. They can make them go through a period of repentance, and then the issue will be fixed. Or they'll keep an eye on them, as much as they can to protect their congregation. But here's the issue. Number one, if you hurt a child in that way, that's a major, major problem that you have. I'm sorry. No amount of prayer, no amount of repentance is going to fix that issue. You need actual professional help. And secondly, you can't possibly keep an eye on these people all the time. It's impossible. Very realistic scenario. You're at a convention, got a single mother. She's got a young child, young son. He keeps saying, Mommy, I have to use the bathroom. I gotta go. I can't hold it anymore. Please, I gotta go now. And she's saying, no, you just went 20 minutes ago. You're just fine. You gotta wait. You gotta hold it. The line for the women's restroom is super, super long. You're too young to go to the men's restroom by yourself. You gotta wait till you can go with me. Wait till the line goes down. Then I'll take you. And then out of nowhere, brother Mr. Nice Guy comes along. He says, don't worry about it, sister. Let me take your son to the restroom. And that scenario there is not an exaggeration. That could happen at any convention, anytime, any assembly, anytime. There's no way they can keep an eye on everybody. Now, going beyond the meetings, when you don't have to register as an offender, that means you can work at a school, you can work at a daycare, you can work being a nanny. And so this is what I mean when I say these organizations are putting children within the organization and on the outside in danger. That's something that I don't really see mentioned in a lot of these reports. I always see them talking about how they're putting the children within the organization in danger. And that's for sure a factor. But I don't see them mention the children on the outside. And that is a very, very important point, because these kids have nothing to do with this. They are not in, this whole fairy tale land that they live in, but they can still be impacted by their outdated policies. If I go out looking for a new home and I look on the abuser database to make sure I'm not putting my child in close proximity of a known abuser, guess what? If I choose a house that happens to be next door to a Jehovah's Witness, a Mormon, a Catholic, an Adventist, the list goes on, all of these organizations have the same issue. The organization may know that that person living next to me is a known abuser. I won't know. I'm letting my kid run around the block thinking that everybody in that neighborhood is safe. There's a known abuser living right next to me. The church knew about it, but they thought that it wasn't necessary to tell the rest of us. That's an issue. That shouldn't be allowed. So now let's skip down to point number 8. The Jehovah's Witnesses' approach to this inquiry and to its activities was premised on the basis that no children or young people were ever in its care. The ongoing failure of the faith to recognize that children and young people were in its care gives the inquiry concern about the faith's overall approach to the safety of children and young people in its care during the inquiry period. So we've seen the Watchtower play this game before, and it's really sad that they would do this to their own members because they're trying to wipe themselves of liability, and they're telling a lie to do it. Because what they're basically saying is you are not really a Jehovah's Witness unless you are baptized. And what they're telling these countries is that there are no children getting baptized. But we know that's a lie. We know that there's 8 and 9-year-olds getting baptized, and we know that they parade them around, in fact, as examples for other children. See what you could be doing? You could be serving Jehovah this young, giving your youth to the organization. It's also really concerning that from a legal perspective, they feel they have no responsibility for the children in their midst. That's scary. That is really, really scary because it shows that they will continue to uphold policies that put children at danger because according to them, there is no children. So again, these are just the main points of the investigation. But all of these points really show that the Watchtower is continuing to put children in danger. They have policies and procedures that need to be updated. But of course, the Watchtower will not update them because they view that this is the right thing to do. And they view that the organization's reputation and brand name should be protected above all else. And with that mindset, we haven't seen the last of these reports. There's going to be more and more countries that will continue to find exactly these things. And unfortunately, as these countries continue to find these things, that will mean that there are children who have had to live these things. It doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't. So now let's get into the second part of this investigation, where the New Zealand Royal Commission give these organizations some suggestions to make their organization more safe. So again, I'm just going to read the main points. So let's skip down to recommendation number 3, which says public acknowledgments and apologies for historical abuse and neglect in the care of the state and faith-based institutions should be made to survivors and support networks. And it says this should be made by the most senior leaders of all faith-based institutions. Now, this is a recommendation that if the Watchtower actually practiced what they preach, for as much as they talk about being humble, being loving, being honest, they really should have done this recommendation a long time ago. If they were really humble and honest and loving, they would be fully willing and ready to acknowledge that they have had this issue. They've had it for a long time, in fact. If they were truly humble, honest, and loving, they would be more than willing to apologize to everybody out there, both the current witnesses and people who have left, who have been impacted and hurt by abuse. But instead, we've seen the Watchtower continually say that these reports about abusers within their midst are apostate lies and attacks from Satan's governments. So now let's skip down to point number 7. Where there are reasonable grounds to believe that torture or cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment have occurred in care, the state, faith-based institutions, and indirect care providers should, now the important part here is point A, which is provide reasonable assistance to any New Zealand police investigation. And part B, take all reasonable steps to ensure an impartial and independent investigation is carried out by an appropriate investigator. Now, this is something that the Watchtower and all faith-based organizations out there should be doing. Again, the abuse of a child is a crime. It's a crime. It's a crime you go to jail for. So therefore, if you have one of your members that have committed this crime, you should be working together with the local authorities to do a proper investigation. So now let's skip down to point number 8. I think this is a really, really good recommendation. It says the government should take all practicable steps, including incentives and, if necessary, compulsion, to ensure that faith-based institutions and indirect care providers join the, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce this, but I call it the PT system and scheme once it is established. Now, when you look up this system, this is what comes up. It says the system should be founded on recognizing abuse, potential to heal, restoration of mana and dignity, accounting for harm and restoring balance, nurturing of well-being, system of fairness, equity, honesty, impartiality, and transparency, safeguarding processes, and safe care. So basically, they're trying to set up a third-party government entity whose sole purpose is to make sure that religious organizations and any organization that has the care of young people and children have to live up to a certain level of standards to ensure that they're kept safe. I think that's more than reasonable, and I think that's something that we should definitely fight for here in the United States as well. I mean, just imagine if there was some entity already set up where if people keep having these issues with the Watchtower, these human rights issues, these abuse issues, they can go and report the Watchtower to this entity. And this entity will do its own investigation into the Watchtower, private investigation, unknown, right? Plain clothes. That way the Watchtower can't all of a sudden get their ducks in a row. And if they find that indeed the Watchtower is putting people in danger, then they can give a list of recommendations to the leadership. And if the leadership fails to implement those recommendations, they lose their tax-free status. So again, I have links to both reports down in the description below. Definitely check them out when you have the time. I'll tell you what, it's kind of interesting seeing these government investigations finding the exact same things that us XJWs have been talking about for a long time. And for those of you that ask sometimes, what is the reason, what is the purpose of doing these White House protests? This is why. Because by doing those events and spreading awareness in a place where there's lawmakers, we have a higher chance of being able to trigger an investigation like this. It would be very, very important to get an investigation like this here in the United States, because in the US is where Watchtower's main headquarters is at. This is where the rules are made. If we get an investigation like this happening here, that might just put enough pressure on the Watchtower to cause them to have some new light and make some much needed changes that have a ripple effect worldwide. Because again, as much as it sucks, there will always be some percentage of witnesses out there that no matter what you show them, they're not going to wake up. They're just not. The best we can do for those people is try to get these policies changed to make life within the organization just a little bit safer for those people that will never leave. So with all that being said, I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you for watching. Take it easy on yourself, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.